What was the food like for the Japanese army during World War II? Speaking of the food of ordinary people during World War II, the first impression is that it is simple, mainly rice balls, sometimes with kelp and seaweed, with a piece of sori and some pickled radish. It became a delicious food for the Japanese army. In fact, this is not bad, but this is the food of the Japanese army. The food of the Navy is completely different. It can be said to be a luxurious meal. Compared with the army, it is completely another level, even reaching the same level in Europe. In the early days of the War of Resistance against Japan, the food standards of the Japanese army were pretty good. According to the standards of 1938, the basic daily food ration for each Japanese soldier was 660 grams of refined rice, 220 grams of Beijing wheat, 210 grams of fresh meat, or 120 grams of canned meat. If there are fresh vegetables, then it is 600 grams of vegetables. If there are no fresh vegetables, it is 120 grams of dried vegetables, 60 grams of pickled radish, 80 milliliters of soy sauce, 75 grams of miso, 5 grams of salt, 20 grams of sugar, 3 grams of tea, 400 milliliters of sake, or 120 grams of sweets, 20 cigarettes. Some Japanese troops even have cash allowances for soldiers to buy various meat products. Japan began to stockpile various materials since the September 18th incident in 1931. By the time of the July 7th incident in 1937, after years of strategic reserves of military power, from weapons and ammunition to military rations and clothing, materials were very sufficient. Let's talk about the food of the army's Sika deer first. Among all the military rations of the Japanese army, the one that best reflects the strength of Japan's national strength is canned beef. The Japanese call this canned food daheiju. At that time, there was almost no beef cattle breeding in Japan. The main reason was that they could not afford it. And most of the beef was imported from the United States, which was expensive, so the Japanese army's canned beef didn't have much meat, but more side dishes. Even so, this genuine canned beef is also very popular with Japanese soldiers. It tastes good and is easy to carry. In the field, just light a fire to heat it up, and then cover it with rice, and you can get a beef rice bowl with rich beef soup. This canned food has a very good reputation in our army. If our army can seize a can of beef in the war, it will be like the new year, in addition to canned beef. Various rice is the staple food of the Japanese army, and the most common one is the rice and wheat rice they make with rice and wheat. Sometimes, for marching and fighting, rice balls of various flavors are also made. The roadmen of the army occasionally distribute bread and biscuits, and at this time they will also be paired with sugar, butter, jam and other auxiliary materials. After the outbreak of the War of Resistance against Japan, according to the Japanese Army's own plan, the quantity of all material reserves was calculated and arranged according to the ability to defeat the main Chinese army in a short period of time and force the Chinese government to surrender and end the battle. Although the Japanese army won almost all the battles in the early stage and wiped out a large number of Chinese troops, China withstood the pressure and not only did not surrender, but dragged the Japanese army to the point of war. And the Chinese battlefield also entered a stalemate stage. At this time, the various materials stockpiled by the Japanese army for short-term combat began to be consumed rapidly. In addition, the United States began to harvest trade with Japan, and the logistical pressure of the entire Japanese army increased. The most obvious manifestation is that the Japanese army's canned beef began to shrink without trade with the United States. The Japanese army could no longer get beef on a large scale. The quality of the Japanese army's canned food began to deceiving from the genuine goods. Not only did the number of canned beef decrease, but the content of beef also decreased, and other meats began to be replaced, such as rabbit meat, horse meat, and canned fish meat to make up for the number, and even canned whales, which were mixed in the army's rations all year round. So is this canned whale delicious? The answer is obvious. If it is delicious, why doesn't the Japanese Navy distribute it on the road? Wouldn't it be simpler for the Navy to seize whale meat? In response to the serious logistical problems, Liu Junmalu began to adopt the strategy of fighting to support the war. The direct method was that the Japanese army went to the homes of ordinary people every few days to rob food, chickens, ducks, cattle and sheep. The indirect method was that the puppet regimes such as Wang Jingwei came forward to double the exploitation of the people in the occupied areas. However, in a war of this level, it is impossible to obtain replenishment supplies by robbing the enemy's people. China was a big agricultural country at that time, but not a big livestock country. The Japanese army could get a lot of agricultural products such as rice, flour and oil from China by despicable means, but it was impossible to get a lot of meat. So Liu Junmalu's living standard was further reduced. The meat ration was getting less and less, and the auxiliary materials such as soy sauce, sugar, tea, and alcohol began to be intermittent. By the end of World War II, the Japanese army could only barely maintain the war situation. The various ratios of the army's supplies were reduced to the bottom. Not only were the auxiliary food seasonings almost cut off, but even the tobacco supply began to shrink. Faced with this objective situation, the Japanese army's canned beef went from the stage of deceiving people to the stage of deceiving ghosts. First, the amount of beef became less and less, the meat became minced meat, and the minced meat became meat powder. Later, they simply stopped putting beef powder in and directly filled it with cow blood. After the Japanese soldiers on the front line got this canned food, they directly gave it the name of pig food can. These Japanese soldiers holding pig food cans were all troops fighting in China. Although their treatment was very different from that when the war broke out, they could at least fill their stomachs and eat canned cow blood by exploiting the people in the occupied areas. The Japanese soldiers trapped on Saipan and Iwo Jima in the Philippines were surrounded by the US military and completely cut off from logistical supplies. Even this pig food was not available. Countless divisions of more than 10,000 people in the Philippines starved to death, and even ate their own kind. In the end, only 1 in 10 survived. In the anti-Japanese drama Shun Liu, Commander Liu took a bite of the captured Japanese military beef can with great expectation, and actually spit out a sentence, "Is this cow cooperating with a mule?" This TV series takes place at the end of the anti-Japanese war, when Japanese canned beef blood had already become popular. So this description is relatively realistic. The top-grade canned beef of the Japanese army had fallen to the point where the 8th Route Army, which was short of supplies, could not swallow it and looked down on it. So although the canned food was small, it reflected the national music of Japan at that time. Compared with the Japanese army, the food of the Japanese Navy can be called luxurious. And even compared with the navies of the same type in Europe and the United States, it is only higher than the United States. The food standards of officers and soldiers of the Japanese combined fleet are extremely famous in history. The flagship Yamato battleship is even more famous, and even has a nickname called Yamato Hotel. These standards and regulations of the Japanese Navy are mainly influenced by the habits of the British Navy, and the greatest improvement has been made on the basis of retaining the country's eating habits, according to regulations. Soldiers of the combined fleet will receive 1 kilogram of rice, 180 grams of meat, 50 grams of fish, and 300 grams of vegetables every day. From the data, compared with the Army, it is not much better. But you have to know that these are just book data. If you look at the specific 3 meals a day, the difference is huge. For breakfast, the Navy has not only white rice, but also side dishes such as dried fish, seaweed, miso soup, and pickled pickles. The staple food for lunch is white rice with 20% barley, and the dishes are more Western, such as pork chops, curry beef and fish salad, fruits, black tea and coffee, etc. Of course, Japan also has sushi and sashimi, which can be said to be extremely rich. The dinner menu in the evening includes sashimi, grilled fish, steamed eggs, miso soup, vegetable salad, and yokin. As a navy, seafood must be very rich, such as lobsters, squids, etc., which often appear on the soldiers' tables. If it is wartime, the Japanese Navy's food will be even better. It seems that fish, seafood, and meat are basically enough. Another difference from the Army is that the Navy's material treatment has hardly decreased from the beginning to the end of the war, and it is fully supplied, and the roads of the Army were very miserable in the later stages of the war. Take the Yamato as an example. Its staffing is 2,300 people, and the ship is maintained at around 2,500 people all year round. And it reached 3,000 people in the later period of the war. Even according to the initial staffing, the ship's cooking team had to make 6,900 meals a day. According to the standard of a single soldier in the Japanese Navy, 1,000 grams of rice and wheat, 300 grams of vegetables, and 230 grams of fish. The Yamato consumes 2.25 tons of rice and wheat and 0.75 tons of vegetables, as well as 0.45 tons of meat a day, and the Yamato has to carry at least 1 month's food for each trip. If it is a long voyage, it will sometimes increase by 3 months. The food reserves for the whole year require 100 to 300 tons, so the food warehouses of the Yamato are all over the ship. In terms of facilities, the Yamato has sailor kitchens and officer kitchens, the latter of which are subdivided into non-commissioned officer kitchens, captain kitchens, and chief kitchens. Among them, the cooks responsible for cooking are generally 60 to 100 people. The sailor kitchen is managed by ordinary cooks, and the officer kitchen is managed by elite cooks, in addition to the best cooks. The captain and the officer's kitchen often hire top chefs to serve in the store. In addition, when dining in the officer's kitchen, officers can also be provided with customized Western food services and can drink white wine, champagne, and other foreign wines, in addition to those necessary meals. The ship is also equipped with a variety of food-grade devices that can produce natto, konjac flour, udon noodles, tofu rice cakes, red bean soup, and other foods. In addition, the ship is also equipped with ice cream machines and soda machines. The soda machine alone can produce 5,000 bottles of soda a day. There are also many small shops on the battleship that can provide various snacks, beer, sake, chocolate, tobacco, etc. You should know that the Navy's salary is relatively high and can be consumed at any time. In addition, the Yamato has a large space, was built relatively recently, and the rooms on the ship are also very luxurious. Their name is the name of a small family, so all the supplies on the ship are fully supplied at the first time, even in the later period of the war when supplies were scarce. The Yamato also had sufficient supplies. Combining all of the above, he got the title of Yamato Hotel. Compared with the Yamato, The treatment of officers and soldiers on other Japanese warships is not much different, but slightly less than the Yamato in terms of variety and quantity. The food treatment far exceeds that of the Army. So the Navy's food is so different, won't the mainland Army protest? It's mainly because the Army and the Navy don't get along with each other, and even hostile to each other. They almost never interact with each other. As for what the other side eats, of course, they don't know. Once in the Battle of Guadalcanal, during the period, Lieutenant Colonel Ishii Masanobu, an Army staff, came to the Yamato to discuss the joint operations of the sea and the Army. The retired personnel of the Yamato were granted the benefit of only giving Ishii Nakazu to eat the lowest-ranking sailors on the ship. Shi Zhongshan ate and exclaimed, "Wow, you Navy soldiers actually eat so well. I have worked in the Army for decades and have never eaten such a meal." This is the evaluation of the worst food in the Navy by the Army Lieutenant Colonel. During the South Pacific War, several damaged Navy Zero fighters were forced to land on the Army airport and were warmly received by the Army. When these naval pilots looked at the meals provided by the Army, they immediately shed tears of sympathy. What was the food like in Italy during World War II? Although the combat effectiveness of the Italian Army in World War II was shocking, the food in Italy was really good, as the war became more intense and the situation worsened. The situation of the Army became worse and worse, and the logistics supply became worse and worse, and the food of the Army was pulled to the bottom. Therefore, the difference in food between the Italian Army before and after the war was relatively large. Italy is a country with a small area and a long and narrow land. In addition, there are no black soil grain producing areas, and there are no sparsely populated grasslands with abundant water and grass suitable for grazing. As a result, Italy's food production is a serious problem, which lasted throughout the war. The Italian government has also called on the people of the country to vigorously plant potatoes and rice, hoping to ease the pressure of food by changing the national eating habits. The effect cannot be said to be no, but it has not solved the fundamental problem. In order to solve the problem of dry rice, especially the problem of dry rice for the Army, Italy is very dependent on imports. This is okay in peacetime, but it is a big problem in wartime. After the outbreak of the war, Italy, which did not produce much food, had a large number of farmers joining the army, which made the food supply even worse, fundamentally affecting the combat effectiveness of the Italian army. The staple food in Italy is generally bread, pasta and polenta, and the army is no exception. In the 1930s, the Italian army's food standard was 560 grams of staple food, 250 grams of meat, 100 grams of potatoes, and 100 grams of fresh vegetables, 20 grams of salt, 15 grams of lard, and 40 grams of cheese per person per day. Officers would have extra tea and coffee, and Italians would have sandwiches to show their noble status. Before the outbreak of World War II, the Italian army's food was improved, with 630 grams of staple food, 40 grams of plants, 350 grams of vegetables, 240 grams of meat, 30 grams of fish, 300 grams of fruit, 60 grams of snacks or candies, and 250 milliliters of wine. Let me briefly talk about it here. The meat that soldiers eat every day is generally unpalatable. Canned beef is called Mussolini's buttocks. There may be some exclusive secret recipe that can make beef unpalatable then. There is this 300 grams of fruit every day. Soldiers in many countries have no fruit to eat. But Italy has this because tomatoes are considered fruits in Italy, not vegetables, so there are a lot of fruits in the Italian army, but they are actually tomatoes. There is also wine. This wine is based on the principle of drinking what you can receive. Sometimes it is beer, sometimes it is red wine. Generally speaking, it is 250 milliliters per day. Generally speaking, the above standards are very good in the world. The problem is that in order to prepare for World War II, Italy only stored supplies for half a year before the war, and it was the third of the Axis powers, and it was very active, going west to France, east to the Balkans, south to North Africa, etc. Of course, we all know that the result was that no war was won, but these few supplies were used up. After being beaten on the battlefield in North Africa, the rebels asked for help from the big brother German army outside the field. The German army is very strong in combat, and the ability to eat is even stronger. Moreover, all the food and drink are supplied by 3D, which makes Italy's logistics worse. In addition, the Mediterranean is getting weaker and weaker against the British army, and the local food supply can't keep up. Antibacterial completely said goodbye to fresh food and could only eat macaroni and pasta. And there is less water in the North African desert, so the taste of the food made is very touching. These pasta noodles either took a long time to cook and became 3 dishes in one, or they were cooked in oil drums and smelled of kerosene, or the Filipino soldiers were unstable and the sauce couldn't be stirred. It was either soaked in water or not, or it was very troublesome to spray. If you say that experienced antibacterial agents will cleverly avoid the roes or the tails, there are many who go too early or too late. In fact, Italy has its own canned food, called RJ Daily Canned Food. The rations are similar to the US military C rations. A set of ARG can meet the rations of a cannibal for 1 day, or the food needs of one person for 10 days, in addition to cooking pasta and seasoning macaroni. There are also sardines, brinjal, beef, pork, chicken, canned fruit, biscuits, coffee, and other single-item rations. The taste is also very bad. In the hot weather on the battlefield in Africa, many will deteriorate and change taste. In order to solve the taste problem, antibacterial rations will have a lot of tomatoes. Put canned tomatoes in the cooking of pasta, canned tomatoes in the macaroni, and tomatoes when eating those unpalatable canned foods. No matter what unpalatable things the soldiers in the field kitchens came up with, as long as they had canned tomatoes, they could still have a meal. How to simplify the food of antibacterial. Tomatoes have a place. After entering Africa, the German army often took the supplies that belonged to the foreign army for themselves, but they came to the same conclusion as the antibacterial. This thing is really unpalatable. Arg is a ration for 10 people. It tastes bad. So will the ration for a single soldier be better? Not really. Because the ration for a single person RP is the RJ that has been disassembled. There is a bit of monkey trickery in it. A standard RP includes a can of sardines, a ham, soup bag, bread bag, and a bag of biscuits. However, the antibacterial logistics personnel focus on a random combination in their own business, so the rebels often have to face the embarrassment of a ration full of biscuits or sardines. In short, the situation faced by the Italian army in North Africa is like this. The local food production is very annoying, and the logistics are a mess. The German army looted and complained, "Is this broken thing you eat for human beings?" In addition, the Allied forces bombed the supply lines like crazy, which resulted in the Italian army being completely useless. In 1943, the Italian economy basically collapsed, with food prices soaring to 48 times the pre-war price and beef to 98 times. From 1944 to 1945, the daily calorie intake of the devastated Italian non-agricultural population had fallen to 1,500 calories, a level that remained until the end of the war.